Security dragged Black CEO from plane, then she canceled their $5 airline deal. I've seen arrogance, I've seen ignorance, but I've never seen them collide so violently until that flight. The boarding area was buzzing with the usual shuffle of luggage wheels and clipped conversations. Nothing seemed unusual until a sharp command cut through the air. "Ma'am, step off the plane." Heads turned. A woman in first class sat still, her eyes steady, a boarding pass resting in her hand like an unshakable truth. Two uniformed security officers stood over her, blocking the aisle. The man in the next seat leaned back with a faint smirk, as though victory was already his. The crew watched without a word. Phones lifted discreetly, recording what they didn't dare interrupt. She didn't shout, she didn't plead. But there was something in her stillness that made even the air feel heavy, like the quiet before a storm that could tear everything apart. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing they were witnessing something far bigger than a seating dispute. And here's the part no one in that cabin could have guessed. The moment she stepped into that narrow aisle, they weren't just removing a passenger, they were removing the person who held the fate of their company in her hands. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you never miss powerful real-life stories like this. And drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels, because in just a few minutes, that flight would cost them more than they could ever imagine. She wasn't the kind of leader who needed to raise her voice to be heard. Years before anyone knew her name, she had been the young woman balancing night classes with a full-time job in a shipping warehouse. From there, she climbed every rung herself. No family fortune, no insider connections, just an unmatched ability to see the gaps in a system and close them before anyone else realized they were there. By the time she earned her Harvard MBA, she'd already built a regional logistics company from the ground up. Within a decade, it became a global force, moving goods across continents with the kind of efficiency other firms spent fortunes trying to match. She was respected in every boardroom she entered, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. Colleagues described her presence as steady, like she carried her own gravity. That morning's trip was supposed to be routine, a quick flight and a final handshake, and the close of a historic $5 billion joint venture. The deal would open new airline routes into African markets, untapped opportunities worth billions more over the next decade. She was the key to it all. The airline's executives had courted her for months, eager to align with her influence on the continent. She arrived at the airport early, as always. No entourage, no security detail, just a slim leather briefcase and a boarding pass tucked into her hand. At the gate, she greeted the staff warmly, thanked the agents as she walked through the jet bridge, and found her seat in first class without a hint of entitlement. But there was an undercurrent she'd felt before. A certain look from one of the flight attendants. The subtle way her ticket was checked twice when others were waved through. She'd read about it happening to others. High-profile lawsuits against airlines alleging bias against passengers of color. She never thought it would touch this day, this flight. Yet as she settled into seat 2A, placing her briefcase neatly beneath the seat in front of her, she caught that same attendant glancing over again, eyes narrowing slightly. The CEO didn't react. She never did. Not in the moment. She believed in choosing her battles with precision, in conserving her voice for when it mattered most. She adjusted her jacket, checked her watch, and took a slow breath. The kind of breath you take when you think the hardest part of your day will be signing a contract. What she didn't know was that the hardest part was already taxiing toward her, wearing a uniform and an assumption. The boarding process moved smoothly at first. She had taken her seat in 2A without incident, setting her briefcase beneath the seat ahead and placing her phone face down on the armrest. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft murmur of other passengers settling in, the occasional click of an overhead bin closing. She kept to herself, reviewing a set of figures on a folded document, final projections for the deal she was about to sign. It was just after the last few passengers filed in that a man stopped beside her row. White, mid-40s, dressed in a tailored suit that suggested he liked being noticed. He looked at her, then at the seat number. and spoke with the confidence of someone certain they were right. "That's my seat." She lifted her boarding pass from the armrest and handed it to him without a word. His eyes flicked over it but didn't soften. "There must be some mistake," he said, glancing toward the flight attendant already walking down the aisle. The attendant leaned in, listened to his version, then looked at the CEO with a polite smile that felt anything but. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" She handed it over again, watching the attendant's eyes scan the information. The card was returned quickly, but not with the reassurance she expected. "Sir, why don't you take seat 2A and we'll find something else for her?" It was as if her confirmation didn't matter. She kept her voice even. "I'm assigned to 2A. "Yes, but we may need you to move to economy to accommodate our seating arrangement," the attendant replied, already motioning toward the back of the plane. "I paid for this seat," she said quietly, "and I'm not moving." The man beside her shrugged as if to say, "Not my problem," and placed his bag in the overhead bin. The attendant's smile tightened, and she disappeared toward the galley. Within minutes, 2 more crew members approached, repeating the request, this time with less courtesy. Her refusal remained polite but firm. No raised voice, no insults, just a clear statement that she had purchased the seat, and she intended to remain in it. A few passengers had begun to watch openly now. One woman in the row ahead whispered to her husband, "She's so calm. Why are they doing this?" Then came the uniformed security officers. Their presence shifted the air immediately, the aisle narrowing in a way that made it impossible for her not to feel cornered. One spoke sharply, "Ma'am, stand up and come with us." She asked why. They told her she was disrupting the boarding process. Her request for an explanation beyond that was met with silence. The man in the suit was already lowering himself into her seat, avoiding her gaze entirely. Phones came out. A passenger in row 3 angled his camera just enough to capture the exchange. Another, farther back, muttered under his breath about overreaction. But the crew moved with quiet efficiency, stepping aside as security leaned closer. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way," one of them said. She rose slowly, picking up her briefcase without a word. There was no rush in her movements, no sign of fear. If anything, there was a stillness about her, like she was already thinking beyond this cramped aisle and into whatever came next. As she stepped into the aisle, passengers shifted, some looking away, others holding her gaze for a brief, silent show of solidarity. But no one spoke up. The cameras kept rolling as she was escorted past first class, past business, into the narrow jet bridge. Inside the cabin, the man in the suit reclined in 2A as though the matter had been settled. The crew carried on, shutting overhead bins, closing the door. The flight continued. Out in the terminal, the CEO walked with security until they reached the gate desk. Her boarding pass was handed back to her with the flat explanation, "You've been removed from this flight." No refund mentioned, no apology offered. She held the pass between 2 fingers for a moment, as if weighing its worth, then slipped it into her briefcase. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the concourse, leaving behind the hum of the boarding area and a cabin full of people who had no idea they'd just witnessed a decision worth billions taking shape in silence. The footage spread faster than the plane could have flown. Within an hour of her removal, the first shaky video hit Twitter, 30 seconds of her being told to stand up and come with us, followed by the sight of the man in the suit settling into her seat. It was enough to ignite outrage. By the time she reached the airport's main concourse, her phone was buzzing nonstop. She didn't answer any calls. Instead, she found a quiet spot by a wide glass window overlooking the runway, set her briefcase on the floor, and just stood there. She didn't cry, didn't pace, didn't even check the flood of notifications. She waited until she could breathe evenly again, then began walking toward the exit. The videos multiplied across social media. One clip showed the initial confrontation with the flight attendant. Another caught the moment security stepped in. Comments poured in, thousands in minutes. "This is straight-up discrimination. She was calm, polite. Why call security? First class isn't only for certain colors, last I checked." By late afternoon, the hashtag bearing the airline's name was trending globally. News outlets clipped the footage for primetime coverage. Analysts speculated about the company's response. When it came, the statement was short and sterile. Our crew followed standard procedures to ensure a safe and orderly boarding process. We regret any inconvenience to the passenger. No acknowledgement of her treatment, no admission of error, just a defense disguised as regret. She read it once, then again, and slipped her phone back into her bag. The words landed exactly as intended: cold, impersonal, dismissive. At the airport's curb, a reporter recognized her from the circulating footage. "Do you have any comment?" they asked. She paused for the first time all day, her eyes fixed on the journalist. "I've been silent before," she said evenly. "Not this time." Then she stepped into the back seat of a waiting car and closed the door. The driver pulled away, and she didn't look back. Not at the terminal. Not at the airline's logo plastered across the building. She wasn't leaving in defeat. Every step from that point forward was deliberate, though no one watching could yet know the scope of what she was about to set in motion. This wasn't a matter of a missed flight or a refund. For her, it had become a matter of principle, one that would reach boardrooms and balance sheets before it was over. Back in the airport, passengers who had filmed the incident were uploading their full videos to longer platforms, narrating their disbelief at how quickly the crew had taken the man's word over hers. Some recounted past experiences with the same airline, describing patterns that no official statement could erase. That evening, a talk show played the footage side by side with the airline's press release, highlighting the gap between what the public saw and what the company claimed. Public opinion was shifting hard, and for the first time, executives at the airline's headquarters began taking calls they couldn't dismiss with a prepared line. She didn't post anything else that night. She didn't have to. The story was already running on every major news site, and her single sentence, "Not this time," was printed in bold across headlines. It was clear to anyone paying attention, she hadn't walked away from the fight. She had simply taken it somewhere the airline couldn't control. For months before that flight, her calendar had been a maze of late-night calls, strategy meetings, and cross-continental negotiations. She'd been courted by some of the most influential figures in the aviation industry, executives who knew exactly how valuable her expertise and network were. The plan was bold. A $5 billion joint venture between her logistics empire and the airline, opening direct passenger and cargo routes into African markets. It wasn't just another deal. It was set to be the airline's crown jewel, a foothold in markets that competitors had been trying to reach for decades, and she was the one holding the keys. In the weeks leading up to the signing, both sides had agreed to keep things quiet. The public announcement would come only after the final signatures, the kind of reveal designed to send stock prices soaring. She had flown into the city that morning for that last meeting, a pen ready to make it official. But after the incident in 2A, her pen never touched the paper. The day after she was removed from the plane, she called her legal team. No emotion in her voice, just a simple instruction: "We're done. Pull everything." By Friday, the airline's boardroom was in turmoil. Contracts unsigned, investor calls postponed, their internal PR department scrambling to manage the rapidly spreading footage alongside the sudden collapse of their biggest deal in years. A financial journalist broke the story first. Sources confirm $5 billion African market expansion falls through following incident involving high-profile business leader. That headline alone sent the airline's stock tumbling within hours. By the market close, billions in market value had evaporated. Inside the boardroom, there were raised voices, slammed folders, and urgent phone calls to her office, none of which she answered. A senior executive who had worked closely on the deal was overheard saying, "We've just burned a bridge we couldn't afford to lose." Business analysts on evening panels called it a textbook case of corporate self-sabotage. You can't court a partner for months, build a deal of this scale, and then humiliate them in public over something as petty as a seat dispute, one said. The optics are catastrophic, the economics, even worse. Every angle of the incident was replayed in the media, on business networks dissecting the financial loss, on community radio stations discussing racial profiling in travel, and in op-eds that used her story as proof that discrimination has no boundaries when it comes to status or success. And through it all, she remained silent. No press conferences, No social media posts beyond her single pointed statement. Not this time. Her silence did what words never could. It forced the airline's leadership to sit in the fallout without a counter-narrative. They couldn't spin her into an overreacting passenger. The videos showed her composure, her restraint, and every headline reminded the public and shareholders that she was the one who had been wronged. By Monday morning, financial experts were openly predicting that the airline's failure to repair the damage could cost them far more than the original $5 billion. Potential investors were skittish. Existing partners were quietly reconsidering their contracts. Rival airlines began making moves to fill the gap she had been poised to create with them. What made the blow even harsher was that the African expansion had been the CEO's personal project. He'd championed it in shareholder meetings, framing it as the company's future. Now that future had been dismantled in a single week, not by market forces or competition, but by the arrogance of a few employees who thought a seat assignment was worth more than the respect of their most important partner. Her decision to walk away wasn't impulsive, it was final. Those who knew her understood that once a bridge was burned in her mind, there was no rebuilding it. And in this case, she hadn't just burned the bridge, she'd removed the entire foundation, leaving nothing for them to stand on. In the weeks that followed, the airline's leadership would try to frame the collapse as a strategic reassessment, but the market didn't buy it. Neither did the public. Every investor briefing, every press appearance was shadowed by the knowledge that their biggest opportunity had been lost because they couldn't see past the color of a woman's skin in seat 2A. By the end of that week, the truth was clear. She hadn't just walked away from a deal. She'd reminded an entire industry that respect isn't optional, and that underestimating the wrong person can come with a price tag that no balance sheet can hide. What happened in seat 2A wasn't an isolated misstep. It was part of a much larger pattern that plays out in airports and airplanes every single day. Data from passenger advocacy groups shows that Black travelers are disproportionately singled out for extra questioning, seat disputes, and even removal from flights. The numbers don't lie. In one national survey, nearly 60% of Black frequent flyers reported experiencing some form of discrimination in the last 2 years. Most of those incidents never make it to a headline. Some stories end quietly, with the passenger agreeing to move just to avoid escalation. Others end with them stranded at a gate, watching the plane they paid to be on push back from the jet bridge. And if there's no video, no bystander to capture the moment, it becomes the passenger's word against an airline's polished statement. In recent years, a handful of cases have gained attention. A Black doctor removed from her seat for appearing suspicious while reading medical journals. A family of 4 escorted off a flight because another passenger felt uncomfortable with their presence. A teenage boy denied boarding after being accused of fake documentation, which turned out to be perfectly valid. The common thread? These weren't people causing a disturbance. They were simply occupying a space someone else decided they shouldn't. And that's the question that lingers. What if she hadn't been a CEO? What if she'd been my niece, 16 years old, traveling alone for the first time? What if she'd been an elderly passenger who didn't have the confidence, the platform, or the resources to push back? Her position gave her leverage most people don't have. Her wealth gave her options that others might never see. But none of that stopped her from being treated as though she didn't belong. That's the part that cuts the deepest. The reminder that status, titles, and success can't fully insulate Black professionals from prejudice. For many who watched the footage, the shock wasn't just in the removal. It was in realizing how quickly it happened, how little questioning there was before a decision was made. It was a real-time example of how bias works: fast, unexamined, and costly. The airline could have chosen differently at any point. A crew member could have checked the boarding pass and corrected the mistake. Security could have paused long enough to hear her side, but they didn't. And because of that, they lost far more than one seat. They lost the trust of the very person who could have helped shape their future. In the days after the videos went viral and the deal collapsed, she could have walked away completely. She could have focused on her businesses, on other partnerships, on simply moving forward without ever speaking about that flight again. But she knew this was bigger than one deal, one airline, or one seat. Instead of fading from the headlines, she began shaping the conversation. Her first public appearance came not at a press conference, but at a closed-door meeting with lawmakers. It wasn't about her personal experience. It was about the countless passengers whose stories would never trend online. She brought data, first-hand accounts from others, and a clear plan for reform. A week later, she announced the launch of an independent advocacy group dedicated to combating bias in aviation. The mission was straightforward but ambitious: protect passenger rights, document incidents, and push for changes in training and accountability for airline staff and security. The organization's hotline opened that same day, and within the first 48 hours, hundreds of calls came in. Stories from travelers across the country describing incidents eerily similar to hers. When reporters asked why she was taking on such a fight when she could simply walk away, her answer was measured but unshakable. "I'm not fighting for me. I'm fighting for the people who can't walk away with $5 billion leverage." She understood the privilege of her position. She also understood the responsibility it gave her. For every person who could afford to hire lawyers or negotiate directly with executives, there were thousands who couldn't. And those were the people she wanted to stand for. The advocacy group's early initiatives included proposing a Passenger Fairness Act that would require independent review boards to assess disputes before passengers could be removed from flights. She called for mandatory bias training not just for flight crews, but also for gate agents, supervisors, and contracted security teams. She traveled to state capitals and eventually to Washington, D.C., sitting in front of committees that usually dealt with air safety and infrastructure, and forcing them to look at something far less mechanical, but just as urgent: human dignity. Behind the scenes, she was relentless. Meetings with aviation CEOs who weren't ready to admit bias existed often turned into hour-long lessons in the realities their own passengers faced. She didn't walk into those rooms angry. She walked in armed, with evidence, with survivor accounts, and with solutions they couldn't ignore without looking willfully blind. Her work didn't stop at policy. She partnered with community colleges and business schools to create travel rights seminars, teaching young professionals, especially those of color, how to document incidents, who to contact, and what protections they had under the law. The narrative shifted. She was no longer just the black CEO removed from a flight. She became a symbol of resistance, of using influence to open doors instead of closing them. Interviews with her rarely focused on the humiliation anymore. They focused on the reforms, the wins, the changes that airlines were being pressured to adopt. In one televised discussion, a journalist remarked, "You've turned a personal injustice into an industry-wide reckoning." She smiled, not out of pride, but because she knew it was only the beginning. Her quiet authority, so often underestimated, was now the engine behind a movement. And every time an airline announced a new bias training initiative, every time a passenger was spared an unjust removal because a crew member paused to verify facts, it was proof that her decision to fight was making a difference. What happened in Seat 2A might have started with prejudice, but it ended with a blueprint for change. And she was determined that the people who could least afford to lose their seat would never again have to face it alone. The messages began arriving faster than her team could read them. Emails, direct messages, handwritten letters sent to her office. Each one carried a different voice, but together they told the same truth. Her story had struck a chord far beyond the corporate world. One came from a young attorney in Chicago. "Your story gave me courage to speak up at work. I'd been told to stay quiet if I wanted to keep my position. Seeing you stand your ground reminded me that silence isn't safety, it's surrender." Another was from a retired schoolteacher in Atlanta. "This happened to my mother when I was a little girl. She was told to leave her seat on a bus. Back then, no one listened. I'm glad the world is finally forced to see it now." Some messages came from flight attendants and gate agents who admitted they'd seen similar incidents unfold in silence, fearing they'd lose their jobs if they intervened. Others came from travelers outside the U.S., telling her that discrimination in air travel wasn't limited by borders or languages. When she finally addressed the public again, it wasn't from a podium or a press room. It was through a video filmed in a quiet office, looking directly into the camera. Her voice was calm, steady. Racism at 30,000 feet is still racism, and it's time we all stop pretending it's rare. She went on to thank those who had reached out, not just for their support, but for sharing their own stories. She urged viewers to document what they saw, to stand with those being targeted, and to remember that accountability often starts with witnesses refusing to look away. The video spread quickly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. It didn't just recount what had happened to her. It validated the experiences of thousands who had been made to feel invisible. In the days that followed, her advocacy group's membership tripled. Volunteers began hosting Know Your Rights sessions in community centers and airports. Journalists kept her story alive, not by rehashing the removal from the plane, but by reporting on the policy changes she was driving. And perhaps the most telling sign of her impact came from a quiet corner of the industry itself. An anonymous letter from a senior airline executive simply saying, "You've forced us to confront something we've denied for too long. Change is overdue." The story had moved beyond a single seat in first class. It had become a mirror the public couldn't look away from, and the reflection was forcing people, from passengers to CEOs, to decide what they were going to do about it. They thought they were removing her from the plane. What they really removed was the ground beneath their own feet. One decision, made in arrogance and bias, had cost them more than any executive in that boardroom could have imagined. And while the airline scrambled to repair its image, she walked forward without hesitation, her stride steady, her head high, her influence now reaching far beyond the flight they tried to erase her from. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to every passenger who's ever been told without words, "You don't belong here." It belonged to the travelers who refused to move without justification, the witnesses who quietly hit record on their phones, the bystanders who stepped forward with their own accounts to ensure the truth had more than one voice. Because in a world where discrimination can be dismissed with a press release, proof matters. Witnesses matter. Receipts matter. She knew the cameras hadn't just captured her removal, they'd captured the reality of how quickly bias can override policy, how easily prejudice can masquerade as procedure, and she turned that moment into a platform that could not be ignored. As she moved through another airport weeks later, the terminal lights reflecting off polished floors, she glanced at her phone. Not for the headlines, but for the messages from people she'd never met, thanking her for refusing to let this be swept aside. Each one was a reminder that the fight wasn't hers alone anymore. To those watching now, have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere? Share your story in the comments. Someone else might need to read it. And if you believe respect should never depend on skin color, subscribe to Echoes of Hope. Your voice, your presence, and your willingness to speak up can change far more than you realize. She disappeared into the flow of travelers, her figure blending into the crowd, just another passenger, phone in hand. But the world was watching, and the industry had been warned. The cost of disrespect can be higher than you think.